Hey there, everybody. My name's Keisha Heck. I'm a sports physical therapist at Four Pines Physical Therapy. Thanks for joining me this morning. We're going to talk about youth sports specialization a little bit here. This is a topic that's become much more popular in the last 5 to 10 years. So first of all, let's define what it is. Sports specialization is going to be defined as an intense year-round training in a single sport with the exclusion or quitting of other sports. So when a kid decides that they're going to not play soccer because they want to focus on lacrosse or football or something else, that would define them as being specialized. So with that, kind of moving forward, what are some of the concerns that we worry about with kids specializing? Not only is it early specialization, but it's also the year-round training, the burnout, the workload issues, and the overuse injuries that we tend to see come along with it. The majority of the injuries occurring in this specialized population are from overuse. For a long time, we tried to pin it on poor technique or the wrong hand position or a poor arm slot angle when you were throwing or pitching, not having enough strength, not having enough flexibility, doing a skill a certain way that would increase the forces on your joints. But really, at the end of the day, the only thing that shakes out in all the research and literature is that these are overtraining and overuse injuries. And then for me in the clinic, these present as your Osgood-Schlatter's disease, your patellofemoral pain, Schinding-Larsen-Johansson, which is another overuse injury. And then all the way up to more serious injuries such as spondylolisthesis, which is a big one in gymnastics. We see that a lot from overuse. An OCD lesion, which can be seen in baseball, gymnastics, and these can lead to surgeries, and the kids are out months and months and months. Stress fractures, little league shoulder, gymnast wrist, Sever's disease. All of these are overuse injuries that we tend to see once kids start to specialize. And they can take an athlete out easily 2 to 6 months. And a lot of kids decide at that point that they don't want to come back. So these are big issues. And a lot of the research is really starting to show us that you're not going to be as good of an athlete if you only do one sport year round. Just because you don't spend as much time developing these different systems. So if you think about any sports team and the best player on that team, what do you say about them? You say they're a good athlete. They're just an all-around really good athlete. And that's because there are fundamental movement patterns, speed, loading, strength, developmental patterns that are consistent across all sports. And if you forget to build that solid foundation because you're so focused on whatever sport you're specialized in, you're not going to do as well. So really, a head start can sometimes undermine long-term development for these kids. And that movement diversity early on, when kids are younger, usually between, I don't know, 8 and 14 typically, that movement diversity allows your young athletes to acquire a broader range of neuromuscular patterns that eventually down the road, when they do specialize, becomes protective for them against injury. That all being said, we still have to specialize. So when is it appropriate for kids to specialize in a sport? And now that depends on what your sport is, right? So if you play a variety of sports that are similar, maybe you can specialize later on. Now, if you're in a sport that's very specific, for instance, dance, gymnastics, figure skating, sometimes you have to specialize early just because the peak is earlier on and it's more of a unique sport. So we see that a lot, and that's okay. But individual sports do tend to specialize earlier just because of the nature of their sports. If you're in a team sport, you can usually specialize later on. That usually occurs for your team sports somewhere between your sophomore and your junior year of high school, mostly because that's when a lot of college recruiting happens and they want to see kids at a certain point. And that's okay. So I think kids that do multiple sports up till about sophomore, junior year of high school, that's very healthy, and then they can specialize after that. So for example, a baseball player who plays soccer in the fall in order to work on his agility and his movement patterns and some leg work, and then goes back to baseball in the winter to train in order to be ready for the spring season, he's going to be better off than the kid who plays baseball year round because he's developing a more well-rounded fundamental movement pattern. So what are some of the factors that may lead to overuse injuries or burnout with youth sports specialization? So all of our governing bodies for all of our youth sports specialization or youth sports, soccer, basketball, lacrosse, Olympic sports have all come together and kind of put together these guidelines for coaches, parents, and athletes to make sure that they're not setting themselves up for failure or for injury. So this is what they recommend. They say, be careful that you're not playing for more than one competitive team at a time. For instance, high school soccer, travel soccer, and then going to a bunch of other tournaments. That can be dangerous. That you're not engaging in competition year round. So that doesn't mean not training. You can train year round, but that you're not in a competition season all year round. They recommend not exceeding 16 hours per week of total sports participation, regardless of the number of sports that you participate in. So if you're playing baseball and soccer, you can do 8 hours of each. If you're just playing soccer, you can do 16 hours, but they don't recommend going over that 16-hour mark. They say athletes should take at least one season off of a sport, whether it be spring, fall, summer, or winter, it doesn't really matter, but they should take one season off from competing or from competitions. They can still practice, but they should take one season off. And then if we look at like the athletes who are doing multiple sports, they can be just as at risk for someone who's specializing in one sport. So you have to be careful if you have a kid who's playing football and then club basketball and also skiing on the weekends, and they're accumulating 20, 30 hours a week of sports participation. They're just as at risk as the 12-year-old gymnast who trains 25 hours in the gym. So you do have to be careful about how you're spacing things out and how many sports you are participating in. So if you are going to specialize, which is going to happen and that's okay, but if it is, how do we mitigate the risk? Specializing isn't bad. My niche is gymnastics, and we tend to specialize kids very, very early. But if we're going to do that, we want to make sure we do it correctly, and we have coaches and a team that knows how to program and manage a year-round training schedule accordingly. So that looks like periodized training. They have an off season and some rest periods built in there. There's deload weeks. There's some sort of arm care, soft tissue care, leg care, whatever their, kind of target joint is, some type of program for that to help with recovery and reestablishing kind of the best version, the best athlete of themselves each time they step on the field. We do stuff like that out of physical therapy clinics. They're very well researched and easy to do and implement. We make sure they have a good strength and conditioning program in order to build a resilient platform and decrease their injury risks. And then we really try to emphasize counting numbers, counting reps, counting minutes played, just so you make sure you're not going over those recommended guidelines. Also watching number of hours per week. If you have a little kiddo under 16, they say your number of hours per week should equate to the child's age. So if they're 10, 11, they shouldn't be training 20 plus hours a week. That's not, they're children still. They still have immature skeletons, immature musculoskeletal systems, and they're not ready for that. They're not small adults, and their bodies don't respond to training in the same ways as adults do. They recommend taking 3 non-consecutive months off each year, kind of in 1-month increments, just to allow your body to recover and get ready for the next season. They also say take 1 to 2 days off per week in order to allow for adequate recovery between training sessions so that your body actually has time to recover and get better before the next time you train. So before we wrap up here, I just want to kind of leave you with some notable facts of people who we recognize in the sports world who maybe didn't specialize early. I think there's a big drive now for kids to specialize, and it's not always a good idea. Eventually it's going to have to happen, but waiting can sometimes be very beneficial. So Steve Nash didn't start playing basketball until he was 13 years old, and he went on to win the MVP award twice. Roger Federer is another one who didn't specialize in tennis until much later on in his career, and he's been very, very successful. Members of the 2014 German national soccer team, they won the World Cup. Their average age of specialization in soccer was not until 22 years old or later on. David Epstein's an author. He wrote the book called Range. He's also a researcher of athlete genetics and performance. And he says parents always ask, what workout was Michael Jordan doing right now? Because I want my kid to do that workout. What they don't ask is, what was Michael Jordan doing when he was 12 years old to get him to where he is now? So remember that. The last thing is, by age 12, it's kind of the highest number of specialized athletes we see tend to be in women's gymnastics, men's soccer, men's and women's ice hockey. So it's going to have to happen. You're going to have to specialize, but I do think that there are some precautions that we can take as parents and as athletes and as coaches to really make sure that we're allowing these kids to be successful, and we're giving them a long career, and still allowing them to enjoy the sports that they're doing. Thanks for joining me. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the feed, or my email is Kaysha, Kaysha, at 4pinespt.com, and I'm happy to talk to you. Thanks.